Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ricky Ponsolana. I'm the director of the Museum Studies program here at the University of Michigan. We know when we have someone special, when despite that it's nice out, there's a lot of people in the room. So, Neil, you're very special. It's my pleasure to welcome and introduce our esteemed presenter this afternoon, Neil Barclay, or Barclay. He said I can say it both ways. In January of 2019, Barclay was selected to lead the Charles H. Wright Museum of African American History as its president and CEO. A former attorney, Barclay was most recently president and CEO of the Contemporary Arts Center in New Orleans. During his 5-year tenure, the institution's budget increased by more than 40%, including lead gifts from some of the nation's leading arts philanthropists. Barclay served for 7 years as Associate Director of the Performing Arts Center for the University of Texas at Austin and is the founding president and CEO of Pittsburgh's August Wilson Center. Additionally, he was instrumental in the historic Capitol renovation planning for Los Angeles Vision Theater, originally built by Howard Hughes and currently in the final stages of development by the city's Department of Cultural Affairs. A leading national presenter of contemporary performing and visual arts, Barclay served on the board of directors of the Association of Arts Professionals for 9 years, including 4 years as its vice president. He currently chairs the board of South Arts, one of the nation's 6 regional arts organizations. Since 2018, he has served as a member of the College of Communications and Fine Arts Advisory Board for Loyola Marymount University, Los Angeles, his undergraduate and law school alma mater. Friends and colleagues, please welcome Neil Barclay, who will be speaking to us this afternoon on Know Thyself, the Importance of Vision in Museum Leadership.
Good. Ooh. Oh. You know when you hear your bio and you don't recognize yourself? Did I do all those things, really? Am I still doing those things? But good evening. I would like to thank Dr. Ricky Ponsolana, did I say it correctly? Director of the University of Michigan's Museum Studies program, for inviting me to speak with you today. And also Amy Smola, who I don't think is here today, also with the Museum Studies program, for her work in dealing with what seemingly was unending logistics in finding a time for me to speak with you. I want to start with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the University of Michigan resides on the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe, the Three-Fire Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations, as well as the Wyandot Nation. In particular, the university resides on land gifted by the three nations and the Wyandot Nation, along with many other indigenous nations. In the 1817 Treaty of Meigs, we acknowledge the language of gift in the original treaty entails mutual relationships between treaty parties, respect and obligation on the part of the settlers, and we advocate for indigenous struggles against ongoing settler colonization and strive for a colonized future. So for those of you in academia, I thought I would start with the Cliff Notes. This is my way of telling you kind of what we'll be talking about, what the major takeaways are of the comments that I hope to make, right? And also to kind of frame our discussion a little bit so you understand what universe I'm trying to talk from. So the things I want you to take away, I can tell you at the top. Visionary leadership is most often observed in those who have a clear and identifiable life purpose that directly aligns with the mission, vision of the organizations they wish to lead. Seems obvious enough. Organizations, like their leaders, also have a clear and concisely defined mission, vision, and values, which provide a shared blueprint for the strategies used to further the goals by that organization's leadership. And finally, as you'll hear in my remarks, I happen to like Michael Jackson and Mahatma Gandhi in somewhat equal measure. You'll find each of those playing out in my presentation today. So our format is going to make some comments, and then I would like to take some questions from you. For those of you who don't feel like you want to voice your question in the entire room, I will probably stay a little bit afterwards, and you can ask me your questions directly. I'm one of those people who sometimes afterwards, I don't necessarily want to get up and talk about, have everyone, but you may want to do that. So there's so much that I wanted to share with you today, and in truth, I had trouble identifying a topic which doesn't simply state the obvious about museums and the need for strong leadership in the current political, social, and economic climate. And then also as a leader of a Black institution, I felt there were things I should share that might not be as obvious to those studying museums writ large. Museum studies reminds us of our similarities as institutions dedicated to the preservation of our community's cultural legacies, so-called best practices, even when such practices are in a period of profound change and re-examination. But our studies of the field do not always lift up the fundamental differences between the work that we are taught about and what the work actually ends up being. I am also cognizant that I come from a different generation of cultural workers whose hope and optimism was brought about by the civil rights movement and other fundamental shifts in American life, which at the time seemed to portend a brighter future that has not been truly realized even to this day. While that optimism does not die, it can invite a kind of cynicism regarding what is possible as we lead museums in the 21st century. Ironically, while I consider myself a leader with a very clear vision of what I would like the Wright, in my case, to be and become, I did not believe I have yet mastered all the skills necessary to become a truly visionary leader. And I hope this is not just a case of false humility, right? But rather a recognition that being a visionary leader is a skill that is constantly developing and evolving. One's vision is extended each day as the possibilities of what one sees take shape and form. That having been said, I did want to ground my comments in the vision that I am seeking to realize at the Wright as a way of contextualizing my later comments. I also wanted to highlight a few of the many challenges facing all BIPOC organizations, as Black, Indigenous, people of color organizations led by, for those who might be interested in pursuing careers in this increasingly important part, I believe, of the cultural sector. Where am I? Oh no. Okay. So everything has come out of sequence. What is happening? Advance here or not? Okay. Don't think that was the next slide, but we'll go on anyway. So I thought I'd start with just what many people believe makes a great museum, right? To be sure, there's some quantifiable things, right, that make a museum great. And Amy Jane Barnes, who's a research associate at Museum Heritage Studies at the University of Leicester, she opines that what makes a good museum includes preparedness to take risks, to remain intellectually and physically accessible while challenging audiences, and presentation of different views and ideas, as well as avoiding, I think this is interesting, neutrality, or rather to refrain from perpetuating the myth that a museum and knowledge is objective, right? Because we know it's not. Museums that have these characteristics are often described as inspiring, and they will also act as catalysts of community cohesion and regeneration and be places where social issues can be publicly explored. So when I think about the Wright, it's often called by my peers an iconic institution. And what do they mean by that? How many of you have actually been to the Wright Museum in Detroit? Thank you so much. I appreciate that. But what I think most people don't realize about the Wright is from its inception, it has aspired to be one of the best museums of its kind in the world. Not just in Detroit, not just in Southeast Michigan, but in the world. At the time it was built, it was the largest encyclopedic museum focused on African American culture in the United States. And to this day is used as a model for like organizations around the world. While the National Museum of African American History and Culture is now the largest museum of its kind in the world, no one is attempting to build another Smithsonian, right? An institution of that size and that scale, right? So the Wright continues to be the primary example of how museums function within like communities of color primarily in the United States. And its challenges and opportunities are emblematic of those found in our sister Black and Brown organizations worldwide. So this, for those of you who haven't seen it, is a picture of the building. But economic disparities have always continued to exist between BIPOC organizations and their white counterparts, right? We are not typically able to rely, for example, on large gifts from individual donors, though we have some, which makes up about 25 to 30% of the gifts to other organizations of our size and scale. Given our constituency, our admission rates and facility rental rates are not as high as our mainstream counterparts, which means that our earned income potential is also less. At approximately 130,000 square feet, the Wright is considered a mid-sized cultural institution, and it's reliant primarily on government and foundation gifts for its livelihood. Our budget of nearly $12 million is primarily supported by fundraising, with less than 25% coming from government sources. What this means is a mid-sized organization in a city like Detroit must generate at least $8 million from philanthropic sources roughly every 12 months. Think about that. Given the penchant for philanthropic donors to change the size, scope, and purpose of their funding frequently, even when giving to cultural institutions, this remains a destabilizing force that we are challenged with daily. So our beautiful building, another view of it, that makes this possible, much of our programming, is not a building we own. How many of you knew that? Any of you? It is owned by the city of Detroit, right? And as you can imagine, having a beautiful building of that size and scale is quite a blessing, and certainly to our colleagues is the envy of many of them. But frankly, it can also be a curse, right? Because if you know anything about the recent history, you know that the city of Detroit has been unable to provide a sustainable source of funding throughout the museum's 30-year history in the building the city built for us, mind you, to occupy. This, of course, makes planning for the future very challenging. And add to this the fact that major foundations are reluctant to support the maintenance and upkeep of an asset the grantee does not own, and the outlook for such organizations becomes very precarious indeed, right? And this is the case of many of our sister organizations. Their cities or their counties built these beautiful buildings, and you see them now throughout the United States, without a source of sustainable income, right? And so we're constantly chasing our tail, it seems. In the Wright's case, however, fortunately, as a nation has sought to address economic disparities in all aspects of American life, after the brutal murder of George Floyd several years ago, the philanthropic community's been pretty kind to us, right? In 2020, the Charles Wright Museum was one of 20 institutions designated as one of America's cultural treasures. America's Cultural Treasures was a two-pronged national and regional initiative established by the Ford Foundation and numerous foundation partners throughout the country to acknowledge and honor the diversity of artistic expression and excellence in America and provide critical funding to organizations that, in their view, had made a significant impact on America's cultural landscape, despite being historically very limited resources. So the designation of Americans' cultural treasures was meant to identify those organizations without which the nation's cultural landscape would be forever changed. Think about that, being named in that kind of company, right? Practically speaking, the organizations named are in large part were those who were many of the pioneers of early attempts to diversify the museum cultural landscape. In addition to the Charles Wright Museum, there is another local museum that was named, the Arab American Museum in Dearborn, would be named along with such notable institutions as New York's El Museo de Barrio, the Japanese American National Museum, the Museo de Arte de Puerto Rico, the Museum of Chinese in the Americas, the Museum of Contemporary Native Arts, and the National Museum of Mexican Art, and the Studio Museum in Harlem, just to name the museums that were included as part of that cohort, which also included performing arts organizations and artist-run companies. That Ford Foundation gift, as luck would have it, would be followed by a major gift the next year from American philanthropist and novelist, you guessed it, Mackenzie Scott. So these gifts have given us much needed time and resources to reflect and plan our future. And notably, the gifts allowed us to operate for the first time on the scale for which our building was built 30 years ago. You can imagine, right? Still, we must wonder, will there be another Mackenzie Scott gift in our future, or one like it down the road? Or will the Ford Foundation continue to design initiatives to galvanize funding to BIPOC, to the BIPOC community in the future? Or frankly, are we just destined to retreat to our former levels of scarcity? As of this moment, it's really an open question, right? Of course, the contraction of government and philanthropic dollars affect all museums, right, of every stripe. But my point is that those contractions, right, serve to further exacerbate a long-standing inequity as it relates to BIPOC organizations who have long been fundamentally undercapitalized. We talked about what makes a great museum, but I want to go on to the Wright itself. I love this picture. So our mission statement, right? So we open minds and change lives through the exploration and celebration of African American history and culture. Like all mission statements, it attempts to underlie the central reason why our organization exists. And it is no less than to change lives, right? By asking our patrons to open their minds to new lived perspectives on African American life that's so critical to understanding the American ideal. But it includes not just an educational imperative in this mission, but a celebratory one as well, right? We acknowledge that there is much to celebrate in the African American story, and it is a story that all of us as Americans should be proud of. In addition to the mission statements, organizations like ours have a vision statement, and it's no less ambitious, right? We envision a world in which the adversity, the achievement, and resilience of African Americans and its history inspires everyone toward greater understanding, acceptance, and unity. That's our vision. That's what we see we're trying to do in the world. And we'll bring this back more to personal level as I talk. But as museum leaders of organizations, we no longer have the luxury to be the so-called beacon on the hill, right? We are by necessity critical assets of the communities we serve. In the city of Detroit, for example, the Wright, despite being under-resourced in many respects, remains the region's largest and most visible cultural asset focused on the history and culture of African Americans, right? But with nearly 80% of the city's population identifies as people of African descent, that means that we have a larger and a broader voice within that community that we must assume and be intentional about. As such, our work must respond to a myriad of challenging issues that not just confront the museum world, but confront the Black community as well on a daily basis. So whether we call ourselves a museum or not, we are an important voice, as many of our cultural institutions are, for the communities we serve. And as we exercise that voice, we must also remain ever mindful that the Black community, for example, is not monolithic, as few communities are these days, right? In the way that we see ourselves as people of African descent, or frankly, as others see us. In fact, we become ever more diverse within our community each day, as people from all over the world come to make their home in our region and nation as a whole. So we traverse these challenges, the challenges of the society writ large, in addition to those facing our colleagues in so-called mainstream institutions, right? So people ask me all the time, well, why do we need a Black museum? Why don't we have a museum that just encompasses everyone? Well, the fact of the matter is that we do have them, right? We do have museums that are encyclopedic in that they attempt to expose us to all kind of culture, art making, etc. But they're only able to do it at a certain level, right? They're not able to really delve deeply into some of the stories that they might be able to as a more focused, if you will, museum. But it's important, so I ran into this quote, which is from, I think it's from the Urban Institute. So They put it like this. So the guardians of African American history and culture tell our nation's story, right? And connect it to the here and the now, right? So when we think of what's happening here and now, I think that's an important story to know about, right? Their curated histories and artwork help us understand the past and light the way forward in today's uncertain time. Indeed, no matter how well-intentioned and data-driven our racial equity agendas might be, they're not likely to succeed in the absence of earnest historical reflection and national efforts to reconcile the unsettled past, right, with the present. I guess it's important for me to state that here that African American museums, they're not meant to be cultural assets just for Black people, which is what the presumption is when people ask, well, why do we need a Black museum? We're going to separate all the Black people into its own museum. No, it's meant to be a cultural asset for all of us, right? It is no more for Black people than a science museum is for scientists, right? If you think about it that way, right? So the Wright is a cultural asset for all individuals who wish to understand African American culture from the perspective of those who lived it, which is different from learning about a culture from people who are hearing about it, reading about it, studying it. Very important information you get from that kind of inquiry, but different from people who were in the rooms when some of these incidents happened, who lived these experiences. The perspective is profoundly different. But it adds to, right, what we might understand from so-called and other encyclopedic museums. So in a time of strained, what I would call strained anyway, sorry, 1 second here. I guess I could take out this staple. Relationships in our country, this perspective serves to bridge misconceptions about our shared history that can be enlightening, but also very healing, right? What could be more imperative right now, right? To have a place where those discussions are lifted up in a way where we can have those moments of, I just didn't know that, or I never looked at it that way, or I didn't understand what it might have been like being in the space when a police officer was on George Floyd's neck. What changed all of our perceptions, for example, of police brutality, right, was the fact it was recorded. And all of us got to see for ourselves what was happening in that moment. This is the promise of, I think, our culturally specific and African American museums. We're telling you those stories, right? Not just how it was, what's the word I want to use, how it was spun in the media or elsewhere about what was it like being there, right? We just, last week at the museum, had Benjamin Crump in for a talk, who's the attorney for George Floyd. And he talked about talking to George Floyd's mother, right? And how the profound sense of sorrow and grief that she had about what happened was not just about police brutality. It was about being a mother, right? It was about being a person that saw someone so savagely murdered in front of them, and in front of her, and someone she loved and had cared for. And even in that setting of the museum, it really chokes me up a little bit already. It broke our hearts, right? So I want to go on to museums. We have institutional goals. This is not following the way that she put this together. But I can riff on it. Okay, I'll come back to it. So one of the things I want to talk about as we get to this notion of visionary leadership is the institutional piece of this. So how does this really kind of spell out? How does it come out in a strategic way, right? And our strategic vision, our institutional goals is divided into 5 things. And I have to say, whenever I shared this with people, they're very surprised for some reason that these are goals of an African American museum, right? But they are, right? And they have to do not just with how we see our mission being most fully realized, but they also have to do with our desire to continue to be a leader in our field, not just one who is following other institutions. One of the first things we wanted to do was center Detroit. We do think that Detroit is a very important place in American life. And if you know anything about history, the Great Migration, obviously the history of automobiles and that in our country, you know how important Detroit is and was. If you're a fan of music, electronica, Motown, jazz, right? And then, of course, the civil rights icons that came from this area, whether they be Rosa Parks or Judge Damon Keefe, right? So we want to center Detroit as a place where we use Detroit as an example, right, of things that are happening around the globe, really, to Black and brown communities. But each of our stories that we tell have this root in this region, right? So we want to be a leader in the field, not just someone who takes exhibits and performances or whatever from other places, but actually creates things, right? So we want to lead in the creation, distribution, and exhibition of world-class programs that are characterized by artistic and aesthetic excellence, technological innovation, and relevancy to current events. Why this is important in our field is because most of what is created for museums of color are not created by them, right? They come from other institutions, Smithsonian being one of the leaders of that, who have created these exhibitions for us. Very nice, very well done, but do not quite get into all the issues that a particular subject might animate. So we feel like there's a role for us, right, to play in that regard. This next one has really been important to me. As you heard from my resume, I've been at a number of different kinds of institutions. And for this room, I want you to know what scares me the most and keeps me up at night is I'm wondering who will do this work in the future, right? Who are the people who are studying this work and who want to take it to the next level? What is their vision? What is it that they see as a possibility of museum organizations in contemporary society, right? It's not just what we saw when we came up, right? And you can see, as I mentioned in my earlier remarks, much of what we have become comes out of the civil rights movement, right? And this notion of equity, social justice, still very current today, right? But what comes after that? Where will you as a generation take these institutions to make them even more relevant and more compelling to the communities that you will serve? So this mentoring museum professionals is not just about the staff that we have, and we have a really robust professional development program for our staff, but we're also developing a fellowship for museum professionals that is more than a museum studies class or course, but is an experiential one. What we're really interested in is giving fellows the opportunity to be with and to shadow very seasoned senior executives in our field. Because my experience has been, whether it was Texas or New Orleans or Pittsburgh or now Detroit, that what I studied and what I came to know about museums was very different than what it was like sitting in a CEO's chair, right? And I don't think there's anywhere else you get that except being able to shadow and be with someone like that, where you see how all of the issues that you might have around your own vision for an institution, how they play against and perhaps for one another, and creating something coherent that you can lead an institution with. Preserve institutional vitality is basically about money. It's about continuing to fight for the kinds of resources that an organization of this size and significance requires. And this last one is perhaps the one that's most surprising to folks, and it's about embracing sustainable practices. It's not just about how our objects and the things that we attempt to preserve, how they're animated in a time of climate change, how they're protected, how they're preserved. It's not just about that. But it's also about, in our case, reintroducing the long tradition of people of color in the environmental movement. When the environmental movement sort of took off, you don't hear a lot from Black and brown environmentalists, right? Even though a lot of these practices are founded fundamentally in the cultures of food, agricultural practices, other sustainability practices that are indigenous, for example, to Native American communities, in fact, to African communities, et cetera. We've lost that thread, and we want to retie that back to the work that we're doing. So those are our institutional goals, and I think you can see how they begin to form an idea of what our vision of leadership will be. So, but as I look at my own work and the achievements of those around me in our field, I began to think about how some of these leaders of these kinds of institutions persevere in the face of seemingly unsurmountable challenges: budget, the political climate, the social climate, et cetera. How do they do it? What is it about them that gets them up in the morning to grapple with the complex issues that we face in today's troubled world over and over again, day by day? And make no mistake, the world is very troubled right now, in case you haven't noticed. It's very troubled. It's climate change, political partisanship, economic equality, social stagnation. But what does that have to do with us as museum professionals? And after reflecting on all these challenges and thinking about the work I do, I came up with this. This came across my desk. It's a call to lead, right? It's not to think about what somebody else could do, what this other organization could do for us, or what. If you really want to see change, and if you really want to lead, you have to be that change. You have to try to become the change and model the change you wish to see in the world. I was going to go off on my Michael Jackson riff here, right? But I might skip it. But for those of you who know Man in the Mirror, right? You know that song by Michael Jackson? Anybody? A couple people have heard of it, right? I love that song. And it just reminds me of how we can walk past problems. We can ignore things. We can ignore people that are they're not even far, they're right in our face, right? And not really recognize them and not think about what could I do really to change their life. But I'm not going to read it. Some of my friends here who read this. So what is it that I need to change? How do I need to grow to be able to lead the institution I love to a better place? And what vision am I bringing to the work that I do? Not just the museum sector, because that's a subset of the work I think we do, but to the world we find ourselves in. Where are the points of intersectionality between museum practice and social and civic engagement? So let's start out with concentrating on what may be the two most important days of your life. Oh, who do I trust? These are slides, I'm sorry, they've gotten a little bit out of order. But I did want you to know about this notion of why museums have become so important in our society. This is an older study. It was done, I think, in 2008, where they asked the American Alliance of Museums, asked people, well, who do you trust to get your news, your information? Look at this, right? Art museums and museums writ large and history museums and historic sites, most trusted, right? I want to go back to, because I know I did have some other comments about that. Oh no, here it is. Here's the next one. So I thought, wow, 2008, they don't trust us anymore, they're mad at us, right? So I found a study from 2021, Museums and Trust. It confirms that the public continues to regard museums as highly trustworthy, ranking second only to friends and family, right? And significantly more trustworthy than researchers and scientists, right? We saw this in the sort of pandemic, right? Many people would not trust scientists, right? NGOs, generally various news organizations, so government, corporations, business, and the social media, least trusted than museums, right? But here's what Mark Twain had to say about us in our lives. He said there's two important days in your life. One, you're born, right? And the second, you find out why was I born, right? Think about it. So who am I? So some of you are wondering, this is visionary leadership, it's for a certain elite, right? I'm not necessarily going to be a CEO of a museum or whatever, right? It's only for great C-suites of the world, right? Well, actually not. For this type of leadership, visionary leadership, is accessible to everyone, regardless of hierarchical level, company size, or sector of activity. It's a skill, actually, that can be nurtured and cultivated. It's a muscle that needs to be trained. The key is not how big your vision is, but how clear it is to you and how willing you are to achieve it and share it, right? So visionary leadership, it can occur at any level of an institution, right? It may not be the one who's creating the overarching vision, right? But you may be charged with envisioning, if you will, how an institution's mission and vision could be more fully realized, right? Through the work that you do at any level of a hierarchical institution, right? I believe that leadership, full stop, and certainly visionary leadership at its core, is a provenance of those who first and foremost understand on a deep level who they are and how their life's passions are most fully realized within the work they've chosen to do. So think about that for a minute. I have found the people that are most successful in the work that they do is because they have found that that's where their passion lies. That's who they are. That's what they would do if no one paid them a dime, right? But as it turns out, that passion, that drive, creates ever bigger visions for what's possible for them. And as they go through life, they're able to affect more and more people, right? To gather more and more people into the vision they have. When people ask me, for example, about things like, well, how do you fundraise, right? It's about passion, really. People get what you're trying to do. They feel it in the room, and they want to help you with it, right? I have some friends who have become very successful actors, many of whom you may know. And when I ask these individuals, how did you, become this great actor that everybody knows, right? And they say almost to a person, I don't know, it's kind of what I was meant to do. Or something like, I just can't imagine doing anything else, right? My work can be challenging, exhausting, exhilarating, but the truth is, it's not a job for me, right? I've never wanted a job, right? I wanted a purpose in life, right? I wanted to do something that was bigger than myself. I wanted my work to be a reflection of everything that I am and knew how to do. So my work as a museum leader happens to be the realization of my life's journey, right? Today, that animates everything that I find worth doing in the world. Is where I feel most alive despite the seemingly insurmountable odds. And far from a coincidence, notwithstanding the circuitous route that I took, and you kind of heard that in my resume, where I landed and where I am today continues to feel somehow intentional and preordained, right? It couldn't have happened any differently. Sometimes when you're going through a difficult part of your life, you go, oh, this is terrible. Only to find out a few months, years later, oh, that's why I went through that. It taught me something about myself, about who I am, and what's important to me. And without that experience, I would have never gotten to where I am today. I feel that way very much about the work I'm doing. So if one believes, as I do, that everyone has a distinct purpose in life, which is designed to improve the world, then our goal must be to find that purpose, right? It is those who find their purpose and have the courage to act on it that become the very best at what they do. Be it butcher, baker, cobblestone maker, or museum director, right? They become the very best. My mother jokingly used to tell us, and I have, 4 brothers and 2 sisters, how many people? 3 brothers, 2 sisters, I have a lot of siblings, right? Some of them I don't count on certain days. I just have to disown them, right? You have siblings like that? Anyway, she said, I don't really care what you do with your life, really. The only requirement that I have as your mother is just to be the very best at whatever you do. Okay, right? But ironically, it's turned out to be good advice because all my brothers and sisters have excelled at what it is they chose to do. I have a brother who's a minister. I have a sister who's a nurse. I have a brother who is a Emmy Award-winning director, right? I have a sister who has raised some of the most beautiful kids you would ever meet, kindest, thoughtful people you would ever meet. In each instance, they said, this is who I am. This is what I think I can do in the planet. And they dove into it, some in cases that later in life went back to school, went to great lengths to realize that vision they had for themselves and are constant, and so are excelling with it. So ultimately, I did determine there's such a thing as, I'm going to skip this. Oh, maybe I'm not going to skip that. As visionary leadership, because it's actually an old term, right? But one worth revisiting, I thought, because it was attributed to Daniel Goleman, who some of you may have heard of, coined the term in 2002, and in his book Primal Leadership. And then this idea of visionary leadership would be also traced to the idea of transformational leadership, 2 very related ideas. But visionary leaders see something in the work that we do not, right? For some reason they see something deeper in it. It means more to them. They see something beyond what we might see right in front of us, right? It's something bigger than themselves that they wish to bring into being. So it's a style almost of leadership in some ways that comes from who you are and allows you to see, create, and innovate. So when I think about how do you do this, right? How do you become this sort of visionary person, right? There's a few things that come to mind, and actually this construction of how you do this comes from a Nigerian cultural worker who I'm not going to butcher her name, but I wanted to credit her at least for this. And so there are four, I think she puts it, 5 things. Get to know yourself. Do you actually know what your unique talents are? Can you name them? Do you use those talents to add value to the lives of someone other than yourself? Right? Do you recognize those talents and do you use them to value others? First thing about visionary leaders. Do you even know what it is that you do better than anyone else? It could be something simple, right? But it could also be something very profound, right? Second thing that she talks about is actions speak louder than words. Don't talk about all the great things you know how to do them, right? Communicate your value through the personal achievements that you're able to realize by utilizing those talents. Not just by having somebody else say, wow, you're really good at that. I didn't realize you're really good at that. You need to know that because you're actively acting on it, right, to further your life and your life's purpose. Third, guess what? Your life is not only about you. We hear this all the time as maybe you sort of read it, frankly, a lot in obituaries where you read it, unfortunately, a lot, where people talk about all the people that this person touched and who love them and who, will be very sorry that they have passed on, right? So we are connected in ways that we don't always realize to the larger world around us. And to be visionary, you have to constantly be trying to connect yourself to that larger world and play an active role in however small that circle might be in moving it forward. Also, there is only one you, right? Did you ever think about that? It's only one you. It's not a lot of yous running around the world. My mother likes to say they broke the mold when they made me, but that's a different issue, right? But there's only one you. So stop comparing yourself to other people. It's a waste of time. They're never going to be like you, and frankly, you're never going to be like them, all right? And finally, latch your identity onto something that cannot be taken away from you. And that identity will change over time. It will grow. It will develop. It morph. Don't be afraid of that. Just be intentional about who you feel you are and are becoming and what you are beginning to see is in purpose in your life. Notwithstanding all of the things that I have done in my career, what I found to be most, frankly, profound about it was, in retrospect, it was all of a design, it seemed to me. It was all like, wow. I didn't realize that building a building from dirt in Pittsburgh, as we did with the August Wilson Center, would inform my knowledge about how to develop a 30-year-old physical plant, right? Which is what the Wright is, right? It never really occurred to me that working in the performing arts would inform how I look at the visual art world that I now find myself in, and the desire for interactivity and interaction and more immersive spaces, how that would inform that, right? So each of these things that I did, they seem to be one-offs, right? A lot of my colleagues kid me about that. Where are you working now? What are you doing? But it's all of a piece, right? When you think about it, it's all of a piece, right? So I wanted to tell you a little bit about now what we're doing, and then I'm going to take some questions. At the Wright, we're doing some interesting things. Ruth Carter, Anybody know who Ruth Carter is? A couple people. So Ruth Carter is the African-American woman who won back-to-back Academy Awards for Black Panther and Wakanda Forever. But what people don't also know about her is she did Roots, Dolomite, Do the Right Thing, Malcolm X, all of those films she created the costumes for. And interestingly enough, she tells the story, she started out wanting to be an actor. And she didn't get cast in a play, and the director said, well, we do need somebody to make some costumes. And she knew how to sew. She said, okay, I'll make the costumes. And over time, she's developed this incredible career that ironically her desire to be an actor informs. Because she's not just creating costumes, she's creating clothing for real people, for real characters. And the way that those costumes are designed and formulated are part of what the character is and becomes in her mind. And so when she works with actors, she starts with them and saying, what are you trying to do with this character? And she creates clothing for them that amplifies that and that makes their performances even more resonant on the screen. It's an incredible exhibition, actually, because she also looks at this concept of Afrofuturism, which is really basically about how using technology and intertwining it with imagination, self-expression, promotes a philosophy for Black Americans and indigenous people to believe and create without limiting the construction of who they are to colonialism, to slavery and those issues, but to an entirely different kind of world. Basically, what would have been possible if we had not been colonialized, right? Who would we have become? And what does that look like? What does that feel like, right? But the costumes in and of themselves, oh yeah, I'm going back, sorry. Oh no, help me. These lovely pictures. Okay, there it is. Look at some of those clothes. When you look at them up close, I always think, when they're costumes, they don't have to be that detailed because, the camera's gonna, do whatever they do. But look at some of these clothes. Look how detailed, the patches, right? The beadwork, right? These all give life to the characters, right? There's the exhibit. This actually is the exhibit in North Carolina, but the costumes, all of these are in our exhibit, actually. This is also the first time you would see Black Panther's costumes from both Black Panther and Wakanda Forever, right? They've never appeared in the exhibit because at the time it first went on tour, the Wakanda Forever costumes were still being considered for the Academy Award. And so they were not letting them out on tour. They were using them for other kinds of things. This next exhibit is called Double ID. This is an exhibit of paintings from the actor CCH Pounder. Anybody know who that is? Yeah. So CC, most people know her of late, I will say, because she was the medical examiner on NCIS New Orleans, right? But what people don't know about her, and again, when you think about who am I, what is my life work about? She not only has this incredible career as an actor, right? But she also has one of the largest and most diverse collections of African American art in the country. This came about because while she was waiting for acting jobs, she decided to start a gallery and befriend artists and buy art and just amassed this collection from throughout the African diaspora, right, of artwork, right? And her husband actually had collected so much art that they ended up giving a lot of the contemporary African art to the nation of Senegal, who created then a national museum to house that contemporary art collection. In Double ID, we're looking at images of Black men from throughout the diaspora done by male and female artists. And you can see, these are paintings, by the way, which are just stunning. Right. We also are beginning to get into technology more with an exhibit on Judge Damon Keith. This is the exterior of the gallery where we created a facade of the building Cadillac Am I naming? No, it's not the Cadillac building. Anyway, the building that he practiced in downtown, it's a tremendous sort of Art Deco building. Recreated the facade, but inside we're using more technologies like this one where we take phrases from his jurisprudence and the visitor is able to reflect them on themselves as sort of embodying that word and take pictures of it for themselves. So there's this interactive mapping that happens. So, thanks. I'm going to take some questions. Don't leave. No, you can leave. Questions that you have of any kind. This is of a particular ilk, this presentation. But is there anything at all that you'd like to know about museums, about the work that you're thinking about doing?
Yep.
Way in the back, yeah.
Could you please use the microphone?
I can shout too. What would you say? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. What would you say your biggest challenge was shifting to working at the Wright Museum versus your previous institutions was?
I only got part of it.
What was the biggest challenge you faced shifting from your previous institutions to working at the Wright?
Lots. Very different communities, right? New Orleans is very different from Detroit, right? New Orleans considered the northernmost Caribbean city, right? In many ways. Its tradition around Mardi Gras performance, et cetera, how they think about art and art making is much more interdisciplinary in work. But really the challenges of the Wright, for me, were the frustration of finding this iconic institution so poorly resourced by the region, right? I was very surprised by that and somewhat hurt by it, frankly. But they created this incredible, one-of-a-kind thing, right, that everybody admires. And I came because, oh, wow, I get to work at the Wright. That's incredible. But when you get inside it, you realize that they had nowhere near the amount of money they would have needed to run the facility that had been built for them. So it's sort of like giving someone a present, but saying, well, you can't really unwrap it completely because, we're saving it for when we have more something to put in the box, right? I don't know, it was very difficult, that was. We're also going through a change, right? Because we've gone from scarcity now to beginning to stabilize and hopefully growing as an institution. And so we have a staff that's used to doing stuff with nothing, right? And now that they have resources, how do they begin to think about, how would I do this if I could do it exactly, goes back to this vision thing, the way I imagine it could be done, right? And not that we're spending, a lot of money willy-nilly, but it gives them a different perspective on their work, right? That people who've been there a long time have never had, frankly. They've never been able to do it the way that they thought it should be done because that was too expensive, right? Other questions? Yes.
We have one here up front.
And then one somewhere else.
Thank you for a wonderful, wonderful talk. So my question is for you as a human, a person.
A human.
You've talked about a vision for service, and you've talked about your passion. Mm-hmm. And I think in a lot of service professions where people expect you to have passion, like nursing and teaching, and I would say museum work, cultural heritage work, there's also a danger that you can be kind of exploited, where you're not paid that much. It is actually a really fun job. So this is supposed to sort of, the interesting work and your passion are supposed to be a form of compensation, I think. And have you ever felt in your career like you had to protect yourself a little bit or advocate for yourself to kind of avoid that idea that you would just work because you love it and you don't need to get, compensated financially or in other ways?
Interestingly enough, I haven't, because I haven't really allowed myself to be exploited, if you will, right? And, you know, those who know me know my career, you know, I'm known for being the person who, when I get to a certain point in an organization where what I am trying to do cannot be realized, might be the board, it might be the compensation structure, it might be the community, that's time for me to go, right? Because in my field, at least, there are a lot of opportunities for me to do good. There are a lot of organizations that are looking for passionate, dedicated, skilled people in the sector. And, you know, there is no reason, there has been no reason for me to necessarily stay in a situation where I didn't feel like what I had to offer was worth spending on those people, if you will, right? And I think it's a hard thing to do because there are a lot of reasons why people stay places. They have family, they have this, that, and the other, right? But it comes down to also being able to be clear about what it is that you do and how much of your life do you want to spend with people and in situations where what you do is not appreciated and not realized. When, I believe, when we get to that place where we're supposed to be, you're more than celebrated. You're more than appreciated, you know. I have this board now, they're lovely people, but stop with the praise of the director. I've got all these people working, you know. But it's been quite beautiful because they understand what I bring to the table and they appreciate it. And they're more than willing to say that. And those people do exist in our field, right? Oh, come on, you have to have a question. Yes.
I actually have a question, but...
Oh,
You can go first, Ricky.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I wanted to say, first off, as an avid lover of August Wilson, thank you so much for your service there, in addition to your work at the Wright. But as someone that's also coming from a performing arts background, I was hoping that you might be able to speak more to how that perspective has influenced your work leading museums in the space that you have.
Mm-hmm. So the performing arts is kind of a different animal, isn't it? You know, because it's more, at least as it's presented, more episodic. You know, you could have a different show every night or whatever. At the University of Texas, where I did, I guess, the most work I did in performing arts, right? We had 7 theaters with 7 different things going on at one time, right? And so there was just a lot of activity that you manage, right? But from an art form standpoint, I think what I found most interesting about performing artists is that their work by its nature is collaborative, right? More so, right? And it's also multidisciplinary when you think of it in terms of how visual artists would explain it, right? And I think that, you know, more and more performing artists, particularly those doing what we call devised work, meaning not writing plays, but creating theatrical experiences, right? They're really interdisciplinary in nature. They're calling on their friends who are choreographers or friends who are scene people or this, all to create this vision, right, together, right? So when I come to the visual arts world, the museum world, I find that very instructive. Because again, it kind of goes back to my ideas about leadership, is that everyone is contributing something. And my expectation is that everybody will contribute something at a high level, something that is felt, seen, known in the final whatever we do, right? So for example, our exhibit designers are incredible, but so are the curators, right? How they put the space, the work in the space, but then how the designer tries to amplify that by how they are constructing, you know, the installation of the work becomes important. Also, you know, we're increasingly thinking about all the senses in the museum world, you know, so we're thinking about sound design as it relates to museum. Your museums used to be quiet, right? It's very quiet in the museum. You want to hear everybody speaking like this all the time. But, you know, some exhibits, you know, if you're dealing with the Motown sound, you might want some sound, right? If you're dealing with Detroit jazz, you might want to hear not blaring, a little of that. So sound design is becoming important, right? And also as we get into more immersive experiences, right? I don't love all of them. Some of them are a little kitschy, but they also invite an opportunity to engage all the senses in a lot of the way that the performing arts does so well. So I think it's really important. In fact, I think particularly in New Orleans, for example, because it was a contemporary arts center, meaning it was all about living artists. On the performing arts side, that interdisciplinarity of that work became an important and significant part of the work that we did there.
Okay. Do we have another question in the back? Okay. We'll go to you after this one.
Yeah, lots of questions.
Hi, thank you so much. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more about how you feel like you balance kind of your own vision with maybe like other stakeholders, or maybe a different framing of the question is, how did you find somewhere that you felt like aligned with your kind of vision? Just thinking about, the relationship between your vision and the vision of the institution and the community and all the many people involved.
Mm-hmm. Well, for me, as I've gone through my career, I've had a lot of opportunity to choose different kinds of situations. And I did a couple of things as I do a couple of things as I think about choosing. One, I'm almost always looking for something that animates what I know how to do and maybe scares me a little bit because there's something about it I don't quite know. Because I always want to be learning something, right? Compensation for me is not just the salary, it's the fact that I know something now by doing that job I did not know before, right? And that's something that somebody can't take away from me, right? So there's that, right? I do a lot of research when I'm thinking about where I want to work and who I want to work with, who's there, what kind of work are they doing now? And I try to think about, can I see myself there? Do I see myself doing that work, whatever it might be? And if I don't sometimes, though, it's like, oh, but they don't necessarily have a thought about the next evolution of what they're doing. And maybe that's something that I can bring to them. When the Wright hired me, we were known primarily as a history museum, although we've always done art exhibits. But they were really interested in this idea of how contemporary artists were grappling with historical and equity issues and social issues, right? So they found my candidacy, I think, interesting because I had both of those experiences. I worked a lot with contemporary artists and also with, historical figure, in this case, a performing artist in August Wilson, right? And his craft. So. But I think it's, again, a question of, do you know what it is you want to do? I mean, it's like when I go to any job, I'm thinking about, well, this is what I know how to do. This is what I don't know how to do. Do I want to learn that from these? Could I learn it from these people? Or is that not a great fit for me? People talk a lot, and searching, about the fit, is this the right fit for people? And I think that's something we need to be more thoughtful about, as professionals, right? And think more carefully about, where do I want to be in the South? Do I want to be in the North? Do I want to be overseas somewhere? Do I want to be in Africa, right? All of those things that might be possibilities for, again, enlivening my vision of who I am, I think about. And all the times you can't do those things, but maybe there's some place here that animates some of those interests in an interesting way. Every organization is different, both from the outside and the inside, right? And so you need to know about the outside, but probe a little bit about the inside and what is this organization about at its core? What is it they're trying to do? And is that something that I could help them realize? Right.
Okay, we have a question over there.
Uh-huh.
Thank you for your talk. I'm a Detroiter, by the way.
Yeah.
And I have a question for you about the history of the Wright.
About
the history of the Wright and its mission. It's such an interesting story because the museum clearly was born at a particular time in the history of Detroit itself, and to be honest, the racial struggles within the city. And I think there are manifestations of that in the history of the museum's buildings, the fact that the building that you're in now is owned by the city. The question that I have for you is, do you feel that the mission is changing in the sense that it, like I think other museums that I guess Edward Rothstein, the critic, would classify as an ethnic identity museum, which has this sort of dual mission of, on the one hand, serving the purposes of sort of heightening and supporting ethnic identity and solidarity and knowledge on the one hand, but then on the other hand, bridging divides, trying to reach outside of the community that the museum is created to support, but to promote knowledge in a larger community. And I think in Detroit that's a particularly stiff challenge given the history of the city. And I'm curious, now that you've been at the museum for a while, what your reflections are about that particular challenge for the Wright Museum. And particularly in terms of its attendance, its audiences, the people who come to the museum, the people you'd like to have come to the museum, and so forth.
That's a good question. I do think, though, that one of the things that has helped me with that idea is remembering that no community is monolithic, and that you're going to have different, not just agendas, but different ways of viewing the work that you're doing based on who is in your community. Detroit, I think you're referencing in part, has a strong Black nationalist community, for example, who would feel that a Black museum is for Black people and not for anyone else, right? But there's equally as strong of an impulse around global African diasporic thought and work, right, in Detroit, very strong, right? And so you have both of these things operating at the same time. So the trick of it is, how do you begin to animate, if you will, or engage all of these diverse kinds of populaces? And part of it is you have different galleries and you do different kind of work in them, right? We have a Tuskegee Airmen exhibit, right? We have the core exhibit that looks at the journey of African Americans from the African continent through the present day. So having those, what should go in our other galleries? Our first floor galleries are now increasingly dedicated to living artists, right? Artists that are living and working in Detroit today, which really enlivens the artistic community. And then in our bigger galleries, we look at these things like Ruth Carter, right? Who everyone kind of knows, right? But who have not really appreciated what it would mean for a Black woman to win 2 Academy Awards back to back, and why that might have been not just a great honor, but one well-deserved, right? And so all of these things are animating at the same time. We also have a very active K-12 program for kids, educational programs for teachers. I do this lecture series called The Wright Conversations, which I just mentioned. We had Brian Crump in, Charles Blow has been in, Nikki Giovanni, the poet, will be in. All different kinds of voices from the African American community. So frankly, programmatically, it's really about curating, right? Curating for the audience you have. And one of the things I love about Detroit is this audience isn't one thing, right? In some communities, you may have a very conservative African American community only. You don't have a lot of progressive people. They might be progressive politically, but not socially, and they're really more interested in history and the civil rights and that movement, right? But in Detroit, you have a little bit of all of it, right? And mind you, I would say the Black nationalist community can be very vocal, right? And so that's always a challenge, but I think it's interesting because increasingly they kind of see what we're doing, right? We are doing things that they're very interested in, but we're not doing that exclusively, right? I also firmly believe that African American history in particular is American at its core history, right? If you look at the influence of people of African descent on American, our values, who people think we are, who they see us as, a lot of it's really rooted in the African American tradition, right? Not just artistically in music, electronica, or Motown, right? But the civil rights movement, the women's suffrage movement, the voting rights movement. All of those things, right, are so embedded in who we are, right? And even, in the electoral process, the role of black women is historical. It's not just a present phenomenon, Black women have always driven, a lot of the striving that we've done for democracy and equality and racial justice, right? So lifting that up and this present moment is really important for people to understand. And also because people do want to separate it. There's this history that we're supposedly trying to erase. Now, we're not trying to erase it, just trying to fill in a few facts that have been left out, in our view, of what people typically hear and know about our historical canon, right? All of it happened. All of those feelings are still there, right? But I think there are some perspectives that people just haven't heard. We see it every day. People come through the museum. I had no idea. I knew that, slaves came across in ships, but did I know that they were stacked on one another for months at a time? Did I know that the children were stacked with their mothers, right, until they suffocated? Did I know that half of them died coming across the ocean? Did I know that? And that's different from saying, the transatlantic slave trade happened and it came over and then there were slaves. Big chapter of nuance that gives you some perspective on why people would feel so strongly about some things. Not that you agree with it necessarily, but you understand. I guess if that were me, I would feel strongly about that, right? Yeah.
One last question.
A Detroiter, I hope.
Detroiter, yes. I'm also a museum member.
Thank you.
And my former life as a PR professional, we worked with the museum when they were on the Boulevard.
Yes.
When they went to the College Community of Creative Services Studies area. Right. I just want to say thank you so much for your leadership. I've watched this growth in the past few years, and it's very apparent. And I just salute you for your service and your passion, and ask that you just stay with us and keep growing us. I appreciate
it. For a minute. I can't afford to retire. Other questions?
Actually, yeah, we can afford to have one more question, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, that was a great comment to end on, actually. But you were talking about your two larger spaces, like where you have the Ruth Carter exhibition right now. Is there a process that you go through internally in the museum where you're deciding like what you want to work on next and what like your next project is going to be? Because under your leadership, you've done a lot of really innovative things at the Wright, and I wondered if you could comment on that process briefly.
Well, I have curators, and they basically bring you things that they're interested in, right? And that's not just on the exhibit side. It's also, we just renovated our theater. We have a new performance series that's going to be debuting this year. I do my Wright conversations, or I have ideas of who I would like to bring. And we all sit in a room and we try to figure out, so what is the through line? What is the connection between all of these things that we feel passionate about, right? And because I think we're fairly tuned into what's happening in the world, it becomes of a piece. Right? That's interesting. I didn't realize that you wanted to do X exhibit because I was thinking about, like the double ID idea for CCH Pounder's exhibition. Beautiful exhibition in and of itself. It could just be an exhibit of paintings. But the programmatic staff was also interested in W.E.B. Du Bois' double identity, you know, that whole idea of having to wear a mask in certain spaces in order to really traverse them, frankly, you know. You had to be a different person in certain rooms than you were in others, right? And so we're using that exhibit, which many of the images that you'll see involve really fanciful, if you will, images of men as a way of talking about how we sometimes disguise ourselves and then what is the essence aesthetically, artistically, socially in that image that we're seeing. So we use it as a springboard for a larger discussion, right? So it's all of a piece. We do plan pretty far in advance now, you know, a couple years anyway. A lot of it's budget driven, you know. You have to get the money for it. But yeah, it's a process of us just talking, you know, seeing where do our passions lie, right? What is it that's really something we have to talk about now, right? We did 2 years ago when I came, we did an exhibit called Voting Matters, right? And it was really about how African Americans further the voting franchise, right? And how even things like the Electoral College, the 2/3 a person, those things, how they affected what we have today as an electoral system, right? What happened during Reconstruction, coming out of slavery, et cetera, right? And it was a real eye-opener for a lot of people because they didn't realize how some of these concepts, ideas, and how we do our voting are rooted in a very troubling past, right? And it's why a lot of people don't understand it. Some of it doesn't make rational sense. It's just the way it is now, right? But where did it come from, right? It's interesting.
Okay, with that, please join me in thanking Neil for coming to Ann Arbor and presenting.
Thank you.